And we're so excited to report that we have 1,200 people who registered for this. So we know that this is an important topic for all of you, and we're excited to dig in. I just want to say a few words before introducing our panelists and turning it over to our moderator. So today, we're discussing an issue that has affected virtually every school district and community, chronic absenteeism. And we know this was a challenge well before the pandemic, but it has become even more pronounced since then, amidst a cascade of changing norms across the context of both work and learning. What used to be a uniform standard of attending school in person 5 days a week has shifted in many places to 4 day school weeks, hybrid learning, and micro schools. Additionally, parents have sought more flexibility and choice in their children's education experience through homeschooling, education savings accounts, and other means that fracture the idea of attending one's neighborhood school in person as the default experience. Amidst these changing norms, chronic absenteeism has spiked to affect all student populations and communities, as many students seek more relevance and engagement in their learning, and as their families seek customization and choice to craft the best experience for their children. So what do these changes mean for our education system overall and for lower income students in particular who rely on school as a place not just to learn, but also to receive basic supports and forge meaningful relationships? And how do we, as education leaders, caregivers, community members, and more, see that all students experience the support, encouragement, and ability to attend school every day and engage in learning, however that may look? We'll tackle these questions in this webinar, which I'm honored to kick off for you. Also, I want to note that since we have a big crowd today, we ask you to use the Q&A box to submit your questions, not the chat box, the Q&A box, but you're welcome to use the chat box to add your reactions to comments and thoughts as well. And we'll try to get to your questions, but we may try to group the questions so we can cover as many topics as possible. So thanks for your understanding. And with that, it's my honor to introduce today's guests. So we have joining us today, Denise Fort, President and CEO with the Education Trust, Johan Liljengren, Director of Dropout Prevention and Student Reengagement with the Colorado Department of Education, Nat Malkus, PhD, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of Education Policy Studies with the American Enterprise Institute, Hetty Chang, Executive Director with Attendance Works, and last but not least, Sonia Brookins-Santelises, EDD, CEO with Baltimore City Public Schools. And we'll be sure to share their full bios with you in the chat box and through a link with you in a moment so you can read their full bios at your leisure. And all of these discussions will be moderated by our fabulous GLR Executive Fellow, John Gopperts. So if you've been with us before, you know we're in for a very engaging session. And with that, John, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Mary, and thanks to Evan, too, for all the work in putting this session together. And thanks to everybody who's joining. All of you are showing up, and this session is actually about showing up. Is showing up a lost art? I think if we're honest with ourselves, I suspect we've all slightly changed our own views about showing up. At the office, at various types of meetings, at social events. So when we think about what's going on for kids in schools, I think it's better to think about this not as a them problem. It's much more likely that it's an all of us challenge. Now, look, as you all know, attendance is hardly a new issue for the campaign. We've been learning about, thinking about, and taking action on this issue for more than a decade now. And all that good work notwithstanding, in the post-pandemic world, the problem has exploded. Some, including some of our guests today, would say that attendance is the single most important reason that the hoped for post-pandemic bounce back hasn't happened. So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about the size and the scope of the current challenge, and we're going to try to dig into some of the whys. Why is this phenomenon happening? Then, consistent with GLR Week's focus on the gaps theme, we're going to drill down into the particular impact of the attendance challenge on kids from historically marginalized communities, from low-income families, and kids of color. Finally, we'll talk about what are we going to do about all this? At the national level or at the local level? What are we going to do to respond to this attendance challenge? And later in the session, as we get to this sort of response portion, you'll hear about a new call to action. You'll hear also what some of the most forward-looking leaders in the country are doing to tackle the challenge of daily attendance. As always, we have a terrific group of experts and leaders joining us today. And as always, as Mary mentioned, we welcome your questions. Please put those in the Q&A box and we will do our best to get to them. With that, let's get started. And I'm going to open up by asking Nat Malkus from AEI to give us some background that will help inform the rest of the conversation. Nat, can you join us? You've spent a lot of time, Nat, studying this crisis of chronic absenteeism, and you put out some really important data with some helpful insights. So can you start us off by giving us a sense of the current state of the problem, particularly as compared to the way it was before?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks, John. So I have some slides here, and if you go to the next one, you'll see some of the data that I've gathered. So this is data from my Return to Learn tracker here at AEI. What you see, those dots are school districts, and this is their 2017 chronic absenteeism. You can see it was rather an incomplete palette, but the colors verge from very light orange to dark red. You want to be lighter and less orange on this rate. In 2018, you can see that, again, we had fuller data that sort of covers the all 50 states. And the 2018 data on the next slide is going to show what this looks like pre-pandemic. And in 2019, it was very similar. We had very little shifts. This is about 15% of K-12 students chronically absent. Now, I'd be remiss not to review that chronically absent means that you miss 10% of the school year. So this is the percentage of students that miss 10% or more of the school year. And again, pre-pandemic, it was floating at about 15%. That's a real problem. That's 1 in 7, close to 1 in 6 students. In 2020, I have the data here. Don't count on it because we didn't have good attendance data after March because the kids went home. And in 2020-21, the next year, it looks darker. But again, you can't really count on this data because a lot of schools were closed and attendance was hard to track. But in 2022, you can see just how bad the situation got. The entire map looks dramatically redder. At this point, chronic absenteeism increased from the pre-pandemic levels about 90%, right between 28 and 29% of students. Now, look, this is a definite problem, but let's remember that in 2022, that was the year of Omicron. This is the highest number of infections that we had. So we might have some hope here that, look, this is a pandemic phenomenon that will go down as the pandemic goes away. But if you look in 2023, you'll see that we don't have complete data for all the states, but we also don't have all that red going down dramatically. This in these states for the best data that we have, still 26% of K-12 students miss 10% of the school year. And of course, the year after Omicron had gone away, COVID was just sort of a shadow of what it was. We can take a look at the next slide, which shows.
Nat,
Yes.
before you jump to the next slide, can you go back to that? How good do you think these data are? What's your confidence level? I mean, I saw 2017, there are a whole bunch of states that don't report anything.
Yeah.
Curious why there's more in 2018. And then I'm curious, like, how consistent is this reporting? How dependable are these data?
That's a great question. I gathered as much data as I could get. The vast majority, all the data you see on this slide is directly from state departments of education. There's a question on how good the data is, and I'll answer it briefly to say the comparisons from one state to another are very difficult because the regimes that capture these data, they just do things differently. They may count what a day absence is differently. It might be half days, might be full days. However, the data that you're looking at was consistent from one year to another on these states. So the fact that across all 50 states, we see this increase is a reflection of the pattern that we're capturing of the growth. That's right. There's very little doubt about that.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's just interesting. I think through this conversation, you may hear me harken back to the Grad Nation campaign, which I happened to lead when I was at America's Promise. And the data question was really a mess with respect to graduation. One of the first major steps was to actually try to get this data regularized across states. So it would be very helpful.
You're definitely right, John. And I'll tell you, Hetty Chang, who's going to come on in just a few minutes here, played a big role in sort of the work that it takes to get these indicators up and set up. And they're much stronger for it. This is another thing, though, John, that gets to that increase. This is a whole bunch of states. It's at about 15%. That's that green dotted line. You can see lots of variation across it.
Yep.
And in 2019, look, the states, they're very similar, right? That looks pretty similar. It's right at 15%. And you can see in the next slide, this isn't 2020 data. This is the 2022 data. You can see how big that jump is from that dotted green line at 15% to the 28.5% about dotted red line. And you can also see that chronic absenteeism jumped dramatically in every state that we have data for. Again, the next slide shows the 2023 data, and you'll see that for some states it went a little higher, most states it went down, but overall it only dropped a fraction of the amount that it had risen. And it's in this year, 2023, which was really kind of the first post-pandemic school year, where schools were definitely open and used to being open, and where COVID infections were really low. This is I've never seen anything like this in all the different data that I have looked at in my long career. Look, we have district level data. So on the next slide, you can see some of the differences by district type. This is 2018 data in blue and 2022 data. So sort of at the height of the pandemic in yellow. This is by district achievement, with the highest achieving third of districts in the nation at the top and the lowest achieving third of districts in the bottom. So there's over 15 million kids in each of these buckets. And look, there's two things to pay attention to here. Chronic absenteeism was different in high achieving and low achieving districts, both before and after the pandemic. So that low achieving districts, in many ways, more disadvantaged districts, had a greater struggles with chronic absenteeism. And you can also see that the jumps were also different. However, if you look at it in terms of how much growth they had, the proportional increase is almost identical. So the highest achieving districts, they went from 10 to 20%, they doubled. Middle achieving 16 to 29, almost doubled. And low achieving 19 to 36, almost doubled. So it is both true that low achieving districts and otherwise disadvantaged districts struggle more with chronic absenteeism, and that all districts saw this same rising tide where everybody's struggles were amplified over the pandemic. And on the next slide, it shows similar patterns by poverty. You can see urbanicity on the next slide, very similar. And then the next slide I show, we gathered data on school closures in 2020-21. The most in-person districts at the top, they about doubled. And the most remote districts, they about doubled at the bottom. Is there a difference in the growth? There is. And the most remote districts are having a slightly harder time. And it's nothing to sort of shake away. It's a big difference, but it's not the driving difference. And I think that's what's important to note. We can also look at this from a different year. So it highlights up at the top on the next slide that this is from 2020 to 2022. So the 2020 numbers are a little bit lower, but these are broken out by essentially student level data by Asian students, African-American students, Hispanic students, and white students. And you'll see similar patterns. Asian students had lower chronic absenteeism early pre-pandemic, and then sort of post-pandemic, it about doubled. But certainly there's a major difference in magnitude between Asian students and Black and Hispanic students. But if we shift this box to the right, we can see that the percentage increase was eerily similar, in fact. And the difference for Hispanic students is actually small compared to the 114% increase across the board. So by race or by district type, we're really seeing these changes everywhere. So I put this slide up. This is the New York Times slide on the share of US students who were chronically absent. When they highlighted this spring, I'm glad they did, but I think that this really illustrates how different the problem of chronic absenteeism is post-pandemic. And the real thing to question is, are we going to have 28 and 26% followed by a 22% followed by a 15%? Or are we going to plateau at some new normal where chronic absenteeism is just something that we're sort of okay with? I think that that's the principal threat that we're dealing with. And that's why now is the time to confront this at every level to really prevent this from becoming a new normal for our students.
Nat, wow. That was both sobering and fantastic. Great job of sort of laying down some tracks about what's going on. Hetty, my friend, you've been working on this for a long time. I first met you, I think, in 2013 when you came to America's Promise to talk about chronic absence. And you've done so much good work for such a long time. And then we get Nat telling us this. So talk a little about what's going on here, what the consequences. Let's start by talking about the consequences of kids missing so much school.
Yeah, thank you, John. You know, I do want to start off by saying one thing I'm glad is that we created the metric for the pandemic hit. You know,
Sure.
what it shows us is that there is a long-standing continued impact of the pandemic that we have not been able to address. And without having this metric, which didn't exist really before attendance work, before the campaign, we wouldn't know that. But one of the things that we're seeing from this is that there are huge ripple effects. The levels of chronic absence increased so that the kind of way in which it affects kids in classrooms is actually different. Before the pandemic, maybe about a quarter of all kids was in a classroom where 20% or more of the kids were chronically absent. Post-pandemic, that was 2/3. We did analysis in California, which found that in 21-22, it was 75% of all schools with 20% or more levels. And in 22-23, it was still 66%. Okay, now what does it mean when you have this high levels of chronic absence? It means it is harder for teachers to teach, for teachers to set classroom norms, for teachers to form relationships with kids, and for kids to form relationships with each other, and for kids to learn. The ripple effects are enormous. So I just want to echo Nat's call. We have got to get this under control. Otherwise, the ripple effects have such a significant impact. We even know that when you have high levels of chronic absence, it makes the kids who are not chronically absent more likely to be chronically absent themselves.
Of course, that totally makes sense. Yeah.
And I think, John, you know, when you go to the next slide for a second, part of what we have to think about is during the pandemic, a number of things happened. Schools used to be a place, like I remember our first analysis, and we saw that kids in Baltimore, even when they were in a violent community, would show up more often to school if school was a safe and engaging place. This was actually way before Dr. Santaliso, who'll be joining, showed up. But in the pandemic, across the country, we said, don't come to school because schools aren't where you're healthy and safe. Stay home. Now we got to remessage that. we shut down relationships because they got literally cut off. And then kids got out of the habit of even being in relationship. Now we reopen schools. We have to recognize this is going to take a long time. You can, and we've seen, and we'll hear about great examples of doing it, but it takes intentionality and support and these high levels. And for some groups of kids, these positive conditions for learning may never have really existed well, but for most groups of kids, they lost these in the pandemic, and it's requiring us to put them back in place. And as we go to the next slide, I just want to say that what our key thing, and I know you know this, we have got to step back. And if I do anything well in this work, it's getting people to shift from what we've had as a long-standing truancy mode. The assumption that if John didn't come to school, it's because John didn't care and something's wrong with John, as opposed to saying, you know what? I got to ask the question, why? I got to unpack. And if it's large groups of kids, unpack if we have systemic issues. If the process, if in our low-income communities, we have huge barriers that might even gotten exacerbated because of the impacts of COVID, or whether it's aversion, we hear so much mental health and anxiety, and kids who are still struggling because learning is scaffolded to feel comfortable in the classroom. Or is it disengagement, especially with our staffing shortages? Or is it these misconceptions? And one of the things I truly do worry about, you started this session off talking about how, that we all got used to staying home, right? But while I think there are a few kids for whom staying home and learning online might work, the vast majority of kids need to be in school to learn. And it's not just about the fact that, there is something different learning from a teacher, learning from your peers, but it's also all the social emotional development that we have in schools. And we need to really take a look at our data and say, what does that mean? We need to both message to kids and families that being in school is valuable. And when you're not here, help them know clearly what they're missing. But we also have to make sure that schools post-pandemic feel valuable, feel engaging, feel relevant to kids' future. And the places that do, that's the places that get kids coming up. And we have to recognize that now, more than ever before, health and education are totally intertwined. We are confused. I will admit, if those of you who know me can tell that my voice is not the same. And, because I've got COVID and all the questions it braces up, even for someone like me. Do I show up? Do I not show up? Where do I, other than virtual is good, but virtual is not the same,
Wow.
And how do we make good judgments? It means we need healthcare providers more than ever before, helping us make sure that we know when to stay home and get access to healthcare as quickly as possible, especially in low-income communities where that can be a challenge, and get the prevention-oriented care that helps us keep in school as much as possible.
Thanks so much, Hetty. Nat, come back for a sec, if you would. You've spent a lot of time researching this, and I know you've been thinking, you've collected this data, but you've been thinking about it too. And so I want to ask you this question I sort of raised at the beginning, like, what's going on? Why is this so high and so persistently high? What do you think's happening here?
Well, I think there's a lot of things going on here.
Okay.
First of all, so the precursors to chronic absenteeism that we saw post-pandemic, they did not go away, right? We have this sort of baseline.
Yeah.
But I think that the discontinuity that we saw over the pandemic has a lot to do with the very powerful messages that we sent out, the ones that Eddie was just mentioning. And look, we send lots of messages all the time, but rarely do we send messages that are attached with salient points like, you might get very sick. You might get people in your family sick. You may increase the pandemic's reach. Those are pretty powerful things. They'll change people's behavior, and they did. And look, we had good reasons for that. Obviously, that's another reason why you can saliently change people's behavior. But I also think that we never had a point where we pivoted back and said, okay, Now we can turn back from the very sort of fearful and sort of overly cautious aspects of the pandemic to say, okay, COVID cases are down, despite the fact that, as Hetty can tell you, you can still get COVID. There's still ways for us to manage this with kids in school. And the important message that I think that we need to bring back is that going to school is actually very important for your kids, that your kids will sort of miss out if they don't. I think that's part of the secret to differentiating the message for kids in absenteeism from other messages about absenteeism. John, you mentioned them, where just sort of across the culture, we've had some of this checking out, not just in schools, but elsewhere.
Yeah, I want to ask Denise and Johan and Sonia to come on camera because I want to spend just a couple of minutes here before we get into the gaps question, understanding this problem. You know, my basic proposition is if you don't understand the problem right, you're almost certain to get the solution, the responses wrong. And I don't want to get us into a trap of blaming kids or blaming kids' parents for doing a lot of the same things that we do and our colleagues do. Like it's hard to get people to go to the office. It's hard to get people to come to meetings now. So there's the thing that's banging around in my mind is this the same problem we've had before, but bigger? Or is this actually a new problem on top of an old problem? So Denise, I know you've been thinking about this issue a lot. I'd like to start with you, and then Sonia and Johan, I want to come and to you guys and get your sense from your interactions with your communities about what you think is actually going on here. Why are so many kids out of school so much of the time? Denise, go ahead.
Thanks, John. Even though we are not sequestered in our homes and people aren't wearing masks as much as before, I think we still need to remember that many families and students are still struggling to recover from the pandemic.
Mhm.
And, as Hetty can testify, there's a new round of COVID going around right now. So we really can't forget that. And students of color and those from low income communities have borne the brunt of that with the loss of employment, loss of health, deaths of caregivers. We've all seen that.
Yeah.
And, remote learning wasn't easy either when you factor in the lack of access to technology and high-speed internet. So the impact of the pandemic and recovery from the pandemic has been very uneven and really set up new norms for learning and attendance. If others have mentioned, I mean, even me, my son's school counted just logging online as attendance. So what is the message that they received there? Not sitting in class, not being present, just pushing a button meant they were there. And that resonates. So we have that. We have students, really still struggling with their mental health. Suicide rates have gone up among young people, which is so devastating. And this loss that Hetty talked about, the loss of social connection, is still very present today. And we all know how important relationships are, both to us, but particularly for our children. Key to their engagement in class, in their social, emotional well-being is relationships. Our kids,
Totally agree, of course.
they have a much better sense of what inclusivity and what belonging looks like. They know what it looks like, and they know when they're not getting it.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. And then there's some of the everyday challenges. that our young people are going through. Lack of transportation for some,
Yeah.
caregiving for their own family, sick, as I mentioned before, healthcare, illnesses. There's so much confusion still around when a child should stay home due to sickness and when it's okay to go to school. Schools are all over the map. You walk into your doctor's office and it says, if you're sniffling and coughing,
Right.
stay home or wear a mask. I mean, there's so many mixed messages. So there are so many whys to this problem. But as Hetty said, as Nat has said, that doesn't mean we can't solve this challenge.
Totally agree with that. Totally subscribe to that. But I think we better realize there are lots of causes here. There's a
Right.
whole complicated set of causes here. So just a single shot messaging is probably not going to work. Sonia, let me come to you. You've been paying a lot of attention to this in Baltimore and doing a pretty remarkable job under some pretty difficult circumstances. What do you think's going on with people staying away from school? We'll come to the solutions part in a little bit, but I'd love your observation about what you think's happening.
Well, I think I could probably +1 everyone who's gone before me, right, to speak, and really just say that I do think, John, there is this dynamic of we have the problems that existed prior to the pandemic, and now we have some of the additional layer, particularly when you're talking about large swaths of young people that we see in Baltimore City. And one major piece is the value proposition of school. One, we have older students who were working, some because they needed to, because again, as many people as Hetty and others and Denise have referenced, who actually had to get out and work, right? And then there's the piece that I think, Nat's referenced on a number of occasions, and that is school became optional. Young people saw that some of what we were providing them before, that they might have been, okay, I called it going to school out of tradition, right? We had like decades long, generational long tradition of going to school. And some of us got by with kind of fair to midland reasons to go to school. And as soon as that disruption came, our young people are incredibly smart and discerning. They said, well, wait a minute, what am I missing? To do what? When I can actually go out and make money, help fill a gap, and frankly, in some cases, feel more relevant. I think earlier on, we're seeing here in Baltimore City, actually chronic absenteeism. Yes, it was high school, but this year we're going deep with our pre-K students. It's our younger students where we're seeing family decisions to say, is it really all that important? Particularly if there's another surge, particularly if, I'm not quite sure. And so we're actually going deep on pre-K when a lot of people in Baltimore City assume it's an adolescent issue.
Yeah, right.
So I think the big piece is just complexity, and that we have to be able to your kind of earlier framing, John, not see this as a one-shot deal. Like if that's what we're going to do, we're not going to actually move the needle. It's going to require the kind of relationship piece that folks are talking about, but relationship connected with actual response and action on the part of schools, on the part of whole cities and communities.
That really makes sense to me. It's a little bit of a scary thought, but I think there was something not great about going to school every day before. And then there's a way just like it's not great when you have a job and you go to the office and actually you sit in front of your computer all day long and respond to emails and then you go home. But meanwhile, you've commuted and irritating things have happened. You thought I could have done that at home, right? So we broke this notion that it was important to go to the office every day. I just wonder if there's sort of a pent up wondering, and then we got this permission structure from the pandemic. Like, yeah, okay, well, you don't have to go every day. And now we have to break that again, because just as everybody's articulated, it is actually important. It's especially important for young people because of the social emotional development and the critical nature of relationships. Johan, anything to add on what you've seen in Colorado? Colorado is a big, fascinating place. You have big cities, fancy suburbs, college towns, and vast areas of rural and not sparsely populated regions. So I'm curious what you've seen about the why. Stay with the why for now. What's going on?
Yeah, I think that's, it's interesting. I think my overall thought, I'd second a bunch of the comments here, but I think that what we're wrestling with and I'm thinking about is like how it's playing out differently in different spaces. And both from just looking at the data standpoint, but then also of how do you respond to that? So I think the first one that we think of, if you looked at a district that in 21-22 had 20% chronic absenteeism, that actually looks fairly good in most cases. But we worked with a couple of districts there who were 10% beforehand. And so their doubling of it completely overwhelmed their systems. Like they were used to having one person or a couple of people worry about that. And so the capacity for that district completely changed, in some ways more drastically than some of our districts that were at 25 before the pandemic. And so I think they're like thinking about how do districts and schools organize around this. That capacity question is very different for those. So that's one. And then another one that we've seen, I think, a similar theme, but just of kind of how you think about things differently at different ages and at schooling. So we've had this kind of health and wellness category that we have thought of. But in our latest data, we had a similar one, as Sonia, I think, mentioned. Our top 3 grades in 21-22 for chronic absenteeism were kindergarten and 11th and 12th grade. So we had kind of these opposite ends of the spectrum there that were really, were really high. And so how do you think about renorming on sickness for a kindergartner and what it means, and how do you help a community do that, and how do you help that versus how do you help think about, in our high schools where we are seeing higher reports of anxiety or not feeling safe, how do you rethink how to make sure that kid is safe and in that space as well. So I think for both of those kind of examples of like just it is complex, and we're going to have to think differently about how do you help the elementary school versus the middle school, and even a district, right? That district that went from 10 to 20 versus that district that went from 25 to 35. Those are in some ways very different challenges to tackle, and I think how we've seen people try to respond to them.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Johan, and we could get into this maybe later, Sonia. When you get to a certain level, you get in the red zone, and then everything starts breaking in a school. Not enough students showing up, then not enough teachers showing up, and you're just in this terrible spiral. So, yeah, let's come back to that. I just want to thank you all for the deep dive on like what's going on. I hope we've shed some light on the complexity, and I hope that light maybe helps illuminate the path forward. But before we get to the strategies for meeting the attendance challenge, I just want to spend a couple minutes here looking at a critical angle. You all know the title and theme of GLR Week is Focus on the Gaps. And I'd like to turn to Denise to start us here. Denise, your amazing organization, EdTrust, is all about educational equity. So can you talk a little about the uneven impacts of absence from school? We know that the effects of missing school land more heavily on kids from historically marginalized communities, low-income families, kids of color. How would you characterize what that impact looks like?
Yeah, I think first we just start with the research. The research says that chronically absent students are less likely to read proficiently by 3rd grade, more likely to struggle academically in middle school. We're seeing trend lines at higher risk of dropping out of school and then out of high school. And then you have the long-term effects, which extend far beyond academics. I mean, we were on a panel with the Chamber of Commerce last week, Nat and Hetty and me, and chronic absenteeism shows up there as well. Like, why would someone want to hire someone who's not shown up? Because they're just not going to show up at work either. They
Right.
have fewer opportunities to build social, emotional, executive function skills, all those things that are critical for success in work and life. And so when you add that to the challenging landscape of where we already are, as I mentioned before, the pandemic landing harder on these communities in terms of health, well-being, whether parents were able to work from home or not, caregiving. Recovery has just been more complicated for these communities. But as I said before, we can do something about that. We know that schools should be considered a resource to communities. It's a source of learning, but also food, healthcare, support services, families, relationships. And we also know, because these challenges have fallen harder on these communities, that we should be doing all of it through a resource equity lens, making sure that funding matters. We've developed a tool to sort of a do-it-yourself resource equity analysis that takes a deep dive into how districts are allocating resources in an equitable way to make sure that they are based on the needs of students and communities. And these keys to success really are about, and you're going to hear this throughout the program, for all kids, establishing clear attendance policies, partnering with and supporting parents in an effort to rebuild relationships, prioritizing student needs. What's really keeping the student out of school? Are they working to support their family? Is it healthcare issues? And then increase focus, Sonia mentioned this, on engaging content and curriculum. We need
Yep.
this for all kids,
Yep.
sure, but with a particular emphasis and a doubling down on our communities who need it the most. And for states, that means setting goals, tracking progress, data at all levels. And of course, our teachers, we need to support them in making sure that they know what students need and they know how to support them. All of these are very achievable. I truly believe this. And this is, why Hetty and Nat and I came together to talk
Yeah.
about goal.
Yeah. We're about to get there. Hetty, did you put your hand up? Is that what
I
happened?
did. That
Okay.
was
And then Sonia, I'd love to hear your observations on, I know, the school district in Baltimore, the demographics of the school district are of a particular kind, and we need to know your understanding of how the intersection of this attendance issue with all the questions of equity that are at the forefront of our minds. But go ahead, Hetty, while Sonia collects her thoughts on that.
I just wanted to offer up that it's also, when Johan talked about, that there are some schools where they've really experienced huge increases. And I want to point out a couple things. It's not just what's happening in communities, it's also in infrastructure on the side of the schools. When you have high levels of chronic absence aren't equally distributed across socioeconomics, they're actually much more likely. And I know that Sonia can talk about this in Baltimore. Historically, where the levels were high, where you saw those ripple effects happening, were in our low-income, high-poverty communities. But also during the pandemic, we shifted so much to the elementary schools that didn't used to have such high levels of chronic absence and who historically haven't had that much of an infrastructure to come up with a systemic response. So we have a challenge, both what happens in communities, but are we equipping our schools with the internal and external community partnerships to actually then address the kinds of significant challenges that are facing kids and families?
Absolutely. Sonia, anything you want to add here on the question of of equity. I mean, you know, the Times article that I think Nat's research helped give rise to talked about the wealthy parents who took their kids out of school to go to Europe for a week, and other parents who, you know, have challenges in work and health and so forth. And look, we know that the consequence for one group of kids is going to be really different than it all gets counted as not being in class, but the impact is really, really different. So how do you think about the equity angle on all of this?
Well, I think some of the way we've tried to approach the equity angle is recognizing that intersectionality that you heard both Denise and Hetty and even Johan referencing. And so one of the things, like very basic, right? And I'll be honest, very transparent. If you had asked me 10 years ago about investing in community schools as an academician, I would have been like, why are we doing that? They're asking us to do everything else. Why are we doing that? Let me tell you something. Our community school coordinators have paid for their salaries 10 times over
Wow.
because of that infrastructure piece that Hetty just referenced, right? An elementary school is not set up to do housing connections, checking in on food. Right now in urban districts, we are more likely to do that. But I will tell you, having the resource of someone who understands how to connect families, because elementary school students coming to school is actually not a student piece. It's a family piece,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so part of how we've approached that from an equity standpoint is, yeah, we could sit there and I could hope families were in a different state than they are, state of being than they are. But the reality is we serve who we have. And to serve large numbers of families in Baltimore City, we had to care about those other elements of life. If we were only caring about, did you bring your spelling book home with you? And does that mean you're going to log in or come back to school? That would not have worked. And so I think the equity frame that we've tried to use is, what are those other components that helped to bring kids back to school in a healthier way? So like one of the things, you know, this whole piece about why kids come to school, well, some of it is finding out who you are, finding out what your gifts and talents are. So we've doubled down, and not to get into, you know, the you know, answers to it. But I do think when we sometimes think of families and young people in poverty, we forget, right, that things like, you know, we had one young woman say, my flute saved me, right? In Baltimore City, my flute saved me. Like I
Yeah.
had something to go to. Sports saved me, right? Like
Yeah.
I had something to engage in. And so it's not just this kids and families that need to be fixed, but it's looking across and saying, what are all of the dimensions that schools need to speak to if we're going to educate the whole child? So yes, it is mental health, but it is also, what am I good at? And why do I come to school? And can I see the connection with the job? We have young people who are, you know, doing AP prep over the summer because we said, if you come to this class, you can also come and get a job. And they were like, hey, that's good enough for me, right? Like it
No
might
kidding.
be.
No kidding.
So I think
Yeah.
we've got to acknowledge that when you're talking about underserved families, it's going to take multiple like strings in the safety net to really have those young people feel supported enough for school to be valuable.
You know, I say this sometimes on these sessions. Um, you know, we're a bunch of adults who are really concerned about academic performance and so forth, but it's worth remembering, like, I went to school for lunch and recess and to see my friends. And then we had classes in between the things I wanted to do, right? That's what drew me to school every day. And we got to be real. Like, kids aren't coming to school because they really want to learn their numbers. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on there, and in our avid and correct pursuit of academic progress, I think we sometimes forget the reality. All right, let's turn the page here, and we'll take the rest of this session. We'll solve the whole problem, right? So first, I want to start at the national level and this call to action that Denise and Nat and Hetty have all come together on. I want to introduce that to everyone and let people learn about that and figure out how they can connect to that call to action and how it can be helpful in their communities. Then I want to talk to Sonia and Johan about what you're doing so far, where you're finding success, also where you have things that sound like perfectly good ideas that aren't getting any lift, because I think our audience would benefit from both knowing what's working and what sounds like a smart idea that isn't really working. So Hetty, I'm gonna turn to you first on the call to action. Then I'll turn to Denise and Nat to chime in on that.
Sure. And yeah, I think we're gonna have a slide, which hold off. Yeah, don't press any more buttons.
No more buttons.
So we'll tell you when. I am so appreciative that AI and EdTrust joined together to be able to work with Attendance Works to do a call to action. Now, this started really because of conversations between Denise, Nat, and then eventually me about how we really needed to take a nonpartisan approach to calling for action on reducing chronic absence. I can let each one of them talk a little bit on the why. For me, though, it's because until we can come together as a country, make sure that regardless of the political perspective as state, everyone is seeing this as their priority and making sure that we can work on this together nationally as well as at the state and local level, we can't solve this issue. Nat, I'm going to turn to you for a second, and then we're going to talk about this goal in a moment. But just why did you even join this endeavor with Denise and me?
Yeah, I mean, I've been tracking data on what happened over the pandemic in lots of different ways. And this was an absolutely sort of, blaring klaxon. I think that this is the number one problem that schools are facing. And I very much care about pandemic learning loss. I just don't see any way to fix pandemic learning loss that doesn't go through major progress on chronic absenteeism. So I think it's really where things need to be focused on. And then the other thing, Hetty, is as I was gathering this data, I was looking for a good story. I was hoping in 2023 we'd see this bounce back. And when we didn't see it, I just thought if this is the new normal, we're in for a world of hurt over the next several years. So really now's the time. And so this certainly isn't a time to go it alone. And EdTrust and you are obvious partners to push on that.
Denise?
Yeah, look, I had the great opportunity to testify with Nat in front of the House Oversight, one of their subcommittees. And they asked us to talk about the state of K-12 education. And in listening to his testimony, it really became clear that we were both focused on the same thing, and that there were solutions to many of the challenges that we both agreed upon. And in this setting today, what better opportunity to sort of join forces and make things known that this is a nonpartisan issue. Nat's data shows red or blue state, all kids, like we're all facing the same challenges. And I agree with him. To combat unfinished learning, we need to get kiddos back in school. So it just made sense. And who else do you partner with other than Attendance Works when it comes to these issues? So the
Awesome.
three of us, it was an easy relationship because we knew we agreed on the challenge and we agreed on the solutions.
And John, maybe just in interest of time, I'm going to run through this really quickly.
Okay, so tell us what this call to action really is.
What this call to action is that every state, every locality should set up the goal of cutting chronic absence by 50% over 5 years. Now, Nat earlier said it increased by 90%. I will say we're really clear. We're asking you to go a little better than you were before the pandemic, because before the pandemic wasn't good. And that shows us. Now, we had a bunch of key points about why this was important. So next one, now you can start clicking. I don't know, Denise, if you want to talk real quick to the first two. But you're muted. So we
Muted.
can't hear you.
I'm muted. You know, I spent over 20 plus years on the Hill, and one of my favorite sayings was, "This is ambitious but achievable." And I believe this goal to be the same. It is absolutely aspirational, but we can meet this challenge. But we can only do it when all stakeholders are involved.
Nat, you want to go to next two?
Yeah, I mean, I think key to this, as we said earlier, look, pre-pandemic, people were different places. Different districts were very different places on this. They all increased. So the idea of, well, we're gonna try and cut it by 50% over 5 years from the pandemic height, that's pretty ambitious, that's true, but it also fits with different contexts, right? And it's trackable and accountable. I know it's trackable. I have the data from 2017, and you can bet, John, I'm going to get next year's data as soon as it comes out, and we're I'm going to track it. And this is the standard that I think we need to make, primarily because this is the path forward to not having the new normal. So it does work in your context, and we're gonna be tracking it.
And I would offer to people that now that, unlike when I started this 18 years ago, there is data on virtually every state website. You all can just go to your states and see whether or not you're getting reductions. But Nat's one is a quick and easy for you to get a sense of what's happening. If you go to the next two pieces, this is also going to take a comprehensive effort. And when we have data that you can see all across the board, it means that everyone can get on board, from chambers of commerce to health agencies to civic organizations. This is require all of us to work together. And this is really about commitment over time. So this over 5 years is not was something that we really thought about. I thought about when I proposed this to Nat and to Denise. This can't, we're going to have to keep pushing, as otherwise, as Nat said, we'll get a couple decreases and then we'll settle for that as a new normal. That is not okay. I also think, because we know right now we're in difficult financial times in the sense of the COVID relief dollars have gone. We're also going through a new election. And you know what happens to ideas when you get new politicians? They forget all the commitment that ever was made by the prior politicians. We can't afford that. Our communities, our kids, our families depend on us being consistent over time and using data. And when the data doesn't happen, if you go to the next slide, I will also just share, we started creating an engagement and attendance state roadmap. We'll get something for the local level too, but this is for the state level first, where a state needs to organize their team. They need to look at across all the agencies, who needs to be involved in this because they have resources to bear. We got to agree upon our destinations, and that'll be different. Maybe you want to start with kindergarten, 11th, 12th, whatever your data might see. And Johan probably already has ideas about what he would start with in Colorado. Then we want to prioritize our routes. And we offered a number of routes that we know work based on what we've been hearing from kids and families. There's lots of different research now going on what kid and family perspectives are and what we see working. Family engagement, student connectedness, relevant and engaging learning, health, well-being, and safety, and access to learning. Now, maybe not all 3 or 4, I mean, all 5 have to be your priorities. You have 2 or 3, but you can figure that out based on what you can build on in your own states and what your data says about what's missing. If kids are saying, I'm bored and I don't see the point of school, and that's your high school kids, you might want to start there for your high school kids. And then once you have that, you got to take it out, share it with people, get more people on board, build your capacity to do this, and then implement, monitor, and adapt. And that's going to happen all the time throughout the year, because that's how you'll get to your 5-year goal.
Fantastic. Wow. Really, really impressive. And just a really impressive also combination of organizations to see EdTrust and AEI working together. Their offices aren't very far apart, but sometimes their positions are. And this is just really, really heartening. And it also speaks to, I think, the importance of this challenge. Johan, let me come to you. When we talked earlier, you talked about some of the strategies that you're employing in Colorado, but also some of the special challenges like rural districts moving to 4-day weeks and so forth. We have people from communities of every size from across the country joining us today. And I think Colorado, because it has such a varied kind of population and demographic, is relevant to just about any community listening today. So tell us a little about what you've done, what has worked, what hasn't worked, what's complicating your life.
Yeah. Well, first I will share that we're in Colorado. We are going to join the challenge that that was just shared among these. I think our commissioner, who started last summer, has really made student engagement a key focus. And in kind of launching we're in a strategic planning process for the past 6 months or so, and student engagement is one of 4 categories there. And I think she has really seen that if we are going to make the progress we want outcome-wise, that work is going to be a part of that. So student engagement and attendance. So I think there is something there of building that awareness and building that common commitment that she is really leading from, and that I think we're trying to do as a department and how we talk about this. So I think that's, to start from there. I would say, just in terms of a couple of things, one more kind of school oriented and school or district oriented, and then one a little bit more state oriented. That's obviously the world I'm living in most, but kind of from the school oriented lens, I would say one thing where we've seen success in this, yes, some from individual interventions. So, new programs that are, either where you're hiring staff or building stronger community family connections. But I think what we've really seen is, especially a lot of districts have used, COVID relief funds for new staff. But when folks have approached that comprehensively, I think we've seen the biggest impact. So they're not just hiring a new interventionist to connect with more families, but they're also looking at their district policy on it and rethinking, like, this is what it's been for 10 years, but is it really, should that stay the same? So I think that's been a really good push of like, yep, let's look at our policy again. Let's look at our data again, and really trying to look at it comprehensively. This is the whole tiered intervention approach, right? We can't intervene our way out of this solution. So like, we have to do both sides at once. So I think that's where I've been really impressed by districts in Colorado, where they have kind of approached it from that comprehensive lens. And then the last one that I think I would mention, something that we've been involved in, but I think could be done locally as well, that I have found helpful in my role, and I think we've gotten good feedback from school districts. We run a number of we call them learning cohorts, and around a number of different topics. One of them is attendance this last year. But I think around the acknowledgement that this feels like a different challenge, and that we need to collectively think about this together. And I think districts have really appreciated time to like, I'm going to share my approach. I'm going to get feedback from another district. Like, no one working on this has seen an increase prior to this of 10 percentage points in chronic absenteeism, right? It was just unheard of. So I think that kind of acknowledgement that like, this is different and we have to collectively join together. Again, we're doing that on a state level. So we had 20 districts together sharing resources, sharing and giving each other feedback. But I think you could do it locally too. Getting leaders together, getting people to talk to and present and share with each other, give each other feedback, look for ways to keep improving. I think given what we are working on and the challenge we're facing, I think we've found it to be a helpful strategy. I think it can be a helpful approach to trying to tackle this.
That's fantastic. Nat, I'm going to come back to you in just a second. You rang the alarm, and now there's some firefighters fighting these fires, and I wonder what you think about their efforts and what you're taking away from them. But Sonia, talk to us a little bit about what you're trying to do in Baltimore.
Yeah, I think where we've seen success over the last few years, because actually it was interesting seeing Nat's national data again, because it mirrors where we were, except we actually have gone down and gone down more each subsequent year. So this year, it's unofficial still, we're around an 8% decline in chronic absenteeism. And the year before that, it was a 4% decline. So we're not quite at that 50%, but Baltimore's locking in with you on that. And I think some of what we did was really something that was on the roadmap that Hetty walked us through from the 3 organizations, which let me just say is, it's great to see that focus. And that's one of the things that has helped us here in Baltimore is we went deep and said, we're going after absenteeism, we're going after attendance, and for very similar reasons. And the great part was we had a chance to partner with the city. We also saw that even things like the mayor, who's very popular with young people, he has like an attendance challenge every quarter, and we made a big deal. And we had press out, and it was our schools that frankly were some of our most challenging schools, upwards in some places 65% chronic absentee rates that were coming down. And so this idea of focusing everyone around a singular issue cannot be underestimated. And our attendance team that's been here, for years said we have never felt this kind of all-out concerted effort from all corners of the city to really push in on attendance. So I do think that's incredibly important. And then the second piece that I think was new for us was real active partnering with community organizations. In Baltimore City, you have to go and get kids. I mean, just to put it bluntly, like you can set up whatever you want to set up at the school. At the end of the day, you've got to actually go and get them. And that's what we saw working. Our re-engagement center, which is designed to, quote, re-engage kids and was in existence before COVID, on average would re-engage about 250 to 400 students in a good year. Literally the last 2 years, the re-engagement center has re-engaged 2,600 students.
Wow.
And that's because, frankly, we partnered with community organizations, right? Like Project Numa and others who actually go in on weekends, right? The rest of us go home and have our barbecue. These are people that live in the community, that know where kids are, and bring them back. I had a young lady who was 14 who had disengaged from school even before the pandemic. She had not been in a physical building in 6 years. And so what happened there was really a family re-engagement to school. And so I don't think we can underestimate that importance. And that's what families and young people are telling us, was that I had a personal connection. Mr. Shaw was willing, gave me a challenge of, can you come to school 4 days in a row? If you come to school 4 days in a row, we have a community partner, you get a new pair of sneakers, right? Like it is all of that and more. And so I do think this personalized approach and systems focus. And one final thing I will say, because someone put it in the chat, we got very disciplined about using continuous improvement, discipline, look at the data, review of what was working in ways that felt kind of scattershot before. So all of our cycles in our schools with the highest levels of chronic absenteeism were really focused on, okay, yeah, you said you're going to try this, but is it working? How is it working? And in 6-week cycles, we've got to change that. And that data being monitored centrally, right? So there are those systems, approaches, and policies that undergird the real kind of bread and butter, human to human touch that allow you to get to scale in ways that if you're just waiting for it to emerge naturally, it's just not going to happen.
This is fascinating to me. What, in a sense, what you're saying, Sonia, is, hey, we got a memo that the school wasn't good enough and we weren't being responsive enough. And so, it's almost like a market response. We need to get better. The product needs to get better. The marketing needs to get better. The support needs to get better, all of that. And I mean, it's really heartening to hear that you've done all those things and that you're seeing results. So Nat, as the dude who rang the bell, I'm curious what you think what you're hearing from from Johan and from Sonia about some of the responses.
Yeah, especially Sonia, the things that you just said about sort of, we are looking at this at the central office. We are all treating this, this is an effort that really is going to take the all hands on deck. I hate saying that because that's a throwaway line that we use on a lot of things, but I really think that that is the case. And look, I'm looking at governors, and there's a reason that I'm looking at governors. I've talked to several state chiefs where I am expecting great things about their 24 data and am waiting for it to come out. And I know that's because their governors have been on point on this and pushing on this. And look, if you have a governor that understands that this is job one for your schools and are pushing the folks below, the superintendents and so forth, then you just have a lot of energy that can actually, I think, pierce the sort of the understanding of all the way down into people's living rooms when they are facing that decision. Well, this kid doesn't want to go to school today, I'm going to make him go to school today. I really think that those are the kinds of decisions that we need to change. That's partially supports, but it's partially sharing the data. It's partially making clear to people that we are making this a priority and that I expect you to be in on it. And I think without that kind of leadership, we're going to have a very difficult time marshaling all the resources that we need to do what is a lot of work. We're also seeing some, and it's important to point this out, that not everybody's doing it. I mean, I'm sorry. I wish I could say, hey, everybody's working wonders and it's working like magic and rainbows, but it's not. Not everybody has been treating chronic absenteeism like it's the problem. I think we've been playing a little bit of catch up in a lot of jurisdictions this past year. And that's why not long from now, a month, if you start in September, 2, this has really got to be in place, and we need leaders that are going to set this as their number one priority, set a goal to make sure that we keep it a priority and that we really bring all efforts to bear, sort of top to bottom.
Eddie, what can you know the campaign very well. The campaign is largely made up of community coalitions devoted to early school success. What can those community coalitions do to adopt this goal? And I'm with Nat on governors leading. I also know that political leaders respond to pushes from below. So what can community coalitions do to help advance this whole cause? What would you like?
Well, the first thing is get their own data. Every single campaign for grade level reading campaign ought to know what their data is. Second is to find out, is anyone already working on this or not? I mean, we actually don't, if you have an existing strong effort, join it. We don't want to create more competing efforts. The other, I think that campaign for grade level reading can be really positioned to is looking at it from a kind of pre-K through 3rd grade perspective. I was in the state of Florida with the campaign, and it was interesting to realize that in Florida, they have voluntary pre-K. They have attendance data, but it's not being used. They know that like a third of their kids, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, are probably chronically absent, but it's not being used in a way that you can then reach out to kids and families. You can find out what's happening when you could have partnerships. If we can start with family engagement with our youngest kids, both helping families understand, and there are a lot of health issues with kids, but I would also say you want to get prevention-oriented care. Like, okay, there's both the issue of knowing when to show up to school or not when you have a symptom, but we actually have a challenge right now of even just basic immunizations. We got 10 states where kids we're at risk of not even having enough kids immunized to prevent measles outbreaks. You want a chronic absence challenge? Wait, we're not even talking COVID now. How do we take a look at what's happening, starting with our youngest kids? Look who's most affected. And what are the big challenges and barriers in our local community that we can be addressing? And how do we engage families themselves in coming up with both an understanding of the challenges and an understanding of what are the solutions that will work for them?
Gotcha. Thank you. That was great. Nat, we have a question in the Q&A box about whether this has been an international phenomenon or whether it's different in the United States.
Yes, indeed. That's an excellent question. There's not as many folks like Hetty in other nations, so we don't know in a lot of these nations is quite honestly the case. But where we do have data tracking it, generally speaking, we're seeing very similar things. In England, they're seeing extremely similar patterns in their chronic absenteeism. They measure it about the same way, and they're not seeing great numbers. And they have very centralized data, so they can track this. And they have a lot of challenges. They have it in Scotland and in Wales and in France and in a number of other nations. And I think that that's pretty important because it suggests that a big part of the problem is that COVID really is the thing that we had these experiences. They also had these experiences, and that it's important to understand that part of the problem if we're going to mount a solution going to hit the change that we saw not only here in the States, but also in Wales.
Yeah, gotcha. Denise or Hetty or anyone, actually anyone could respond to this. The one thing that stood out in the data that Nat put up, he sort of poo-pooed this point, but I think somebody wanted to go further, and I agree with this someone. The data for Hispanic Latino students was different, a bigger increase among those young people. Do we have a sense of what's going on, and do we have any specific strategies to reach those young people and their families?
John, I've we've been doing some work in California. Chronic absence is about 40%. At the 21-22, it's 36% in 22-23, and about 80% of those kids were Latino. Because of the demographics of California. And we've actually been working with PK and families and schools to unpack what's going on. I think there are a number of different issues. One is we saw before the pandemic, English language learners were actually, particularly young ones, were slightly more likely to show up to school than English speakers. You know, it's like, hey, I brought my kids here to this country. Maybe this is a stereotype, but because I want a better future, I know how to get you a better future. You show up to school. Pandemic hits, and you've got one, we're not very good about communicating in other languages than English, even though we're better on Spanish than others. But these are also communities that were hard hit. So you got kids in multi-generational households. You're worried about, getting grandma sick. You don't have access to healthcare. You have a lot of kids who don't, their families don't have access. You had a lot of pandemic death. These were the frontline workers who experienced. So those challenges, and then I would additionally add in, it's kind of on top of the pandemic, we had a huge spate of school violence. We've seen that across the community. But what happened in Texas had huge reverberations. Kids and families, you see Latino surveys of Latino families, they're worried about school safety and bullying.
Wow.
And we're in a country where we've blamed kids. We've blamed ethnic groups for our challenges. That bullying issue creates a sense of lack of safety that compounds what's going on around concerns of health, but emotional. When I would just say, though, in California, one last thing is we did this work with the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, and in collaboration with these other groups, where we found districts that had better kindergarten chronic absence than all the 1,000 other districts in California, 20 districts, and we went to 3. And in those districts, the key was family engagement. The key was health-related services. The key was really creating a sense of safety in classrooms where kids didn't feel blamed. And part of the family engagement, though, was real, you have to make sure, we have schools where sometimes you have, we have fences around our schools. Families don't even drop their kids off to their teachers anymore. How do we intentionally create multilingual engagement where families know what kids are missing when they aren't there, know that their kids are missed, and we build that sense of engagement? And if kids are nervous about coming to school, we create supports. There's a whole set of wonderful stories by Corey Turner on NPR that document Livingston, California, that show what it takes to get kids back to school. And
Mhm.
again, it's relationships, 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 but in the languages that families spoke and offered by people that families trust.
Yeah. Johan, anything, thank you, Hetty, that was fantastic. Johan, anything specific on reaching Hispanic Latino families? And everybody, the poll just came up. You can fill out the poll and continue to listen, and we really want your responses. Helps us sharpen and make these sessions as valuable as possible. Sorry, go ahead, Johan.
Yeah, I don't know that we have anything specific. I think some of the strategies that Hetty talked about, I think we're seeing there, and we do see a gap, quite a big gap between our statewide rate and our Hispanic students when we disaggregate it. But I don't think I'm aware of anything that we've done specifically at the state level around to target or to think specifically around that. I think we've in many cases used many of the same scenarios, I think, in that school connectedness and trying to build some of those relationships there.
Great. Thank you. Sonia, did you want to add anything on that question?
No, just briefly, I would say with our Latino community, we have partnered very closely with the faith community because a number of pastors have said to me, we can get to families in ways you can't. And it goes back to this idea of partnering with community, and that has been particularly helpful with our Latino communities.
You know, at the session at AEI last week, Denise and Nat especially talked a lot about this is actually a whole of society kind of response, that we can't just expect school leaders to solve this. And part of what I heard from you, Sonia, is engaging all the mayor, all kinds of folks. Denise, you were so good on the thing at AEI last week about this whole of society idea. Talk a little bit about what that looks like, because I think there's some interesting hints in here for community coalitions and new opportunities to work with people who perhaps in the past hadn't been as activated around school success.
Yeah, look, I mean, families are going to listen to people that they trust. And it's those trusted partners, whether it's faith-based or your neighbor at the grocery store or the out of school, the after school partners that you work with. They're going to listen to those folks. And I think, Nat said this, it is a all hands on deck approach that we really need to make this work. And it is clear both kids need strong relationships and families need strong relationships in order to really make things happen. And so I'm excited to hear what Colorado and Baltimore are doing, because I think they are using that approach because they have really seen, in order to meet the needs of students and families, it will take everybody's involvement.
Sonia, thank you, Denise. Sonia, I'm curious, as you've and also Johan, as districts have staffed up to respond to this concern, some people have talked about the importance of hiring people from the community to do this work. So the people who are encouraging you to go to school are not just those school people. They're actually the people you run into in the grocery store, the dude who lives around the corner. Have you tried any of those kinds of strategies to more closely connect the school and the community?
Yes, we have, and much to the chagrin of my chief financial officer, because, no, I mean, very forthrightly, because we had reduced like incredibly the number of, contractors and temporary employees that kind of get big systems like us in trouble if we get too much. And I got to tell you, we reinvested because we actually get a pretty big ROI on engaging with existing community organizations around this work for some of the reasons that I talked about before, but also because they bring a full suite of other support. So it's not just,
Yeah.
come now for today. It's also, we've got a mentoring program over here, right?
Mhm.
We have a summer program there. And they then partner in the schools with extended learning, right? And so it's a symbiotic relationship. The other piece is there are just systems of community elders that go way beyond what the formal roles
Yeah.
in a large public school system are. They're
Totally.
who are
I mean,
gonna
I
listen.
totally agree. Like people are skeptical about systems, but if like your best friend's grandma is the one who's working at school,
Exactly.
you damn sure going to show up at school because you don't want to get in trouble.
No, absolutely. And again, you need it at scale.
Right.
But if you're building infrastructure around, and a lot of those organizations, frankly, were there long before I was CEO, they'll be there long after. What they usually lack is infrastructure, right? And
Yeah.
so some of that makes it challenging. So it really does have to be a partnership. And as I think Hetty and others were saying, the same is true for healthcare, right? If you're
You bet.
looking for school systems to have enough school psychologists, folks, you might as well like get off the train now. That's not happening any time soon, right? There are shortages everywhere. But when you partner with community-based mental health organizations, you have other ways of providing those services. So it's been, I will say, the biggest kind of whole district revelation we've had is we should have known before that we couldn't do it all by ourselves. But if you are under any delusion that you could as a school system post-COVID, that notion should be completely washed away.
Y'all, we're out of time. I'm going to call Mary back on the screen, but I just want to say, like, the Olympics start on Friday, and I feel like we had a bunch of Olympians on this subject, on this session. And I just want to thank all of you for all of the tremendous comments and the tremendous work going on. And Ralph's not here right now, so I'm just gonna say that the campaign is down with this all the way, and we want to do everything we can to help make this happen. So Nat, Johan, Hetty, Sonia, Denise, thanks so much for being with us today and for your fantastic comments.